have, in terms of the weight, what is the vertical component of the reactive force? So first, we need to look at the frictional, the force of the, I don't know how to say this muscle, but acetabulum on the femoral head. So when we have the leg in figure 1, we have the, we need to understand that the Fr is the force, the reactive force of the acetabulum on the femoral head. And we can split that reactive force into two components, the horizontal component and the vertical component. And when we are looking at the free body diagram, let me see if I can switch tabs to share that with you guys. Can you guys see this tab?
Yeah, we can see it.
Perfect, thank you. So when we look at this reactive force right here, we can split it into the force that pulls in this direction to the left and the force that pulls this direction straight down. So we need to understand that in this case, since we are looking at, if this is the hypotenuse, this is the long leg, and this is the horizontal force, the short leg, we need to recognize that the sine of this angle would be the long legs force. So since this angle is equivalent to the angle here between this horizontal force and the hypotenuse, the sine of that angle would lead to the length of this vertical component of the reactive force. But when we go back to the passage, we can recognize that the frictional force, or the reactive force overall, is equivalent to 0. And so we have to solve for the torque from here and find our way back to the vertical component of the force. Since we know that 7 times all of this is equal to 0, we know that what's inside is also equal to 0. And so the Fr sine 77.3 has to be equal to 2.31. So we just work our way back after understanding that this is representative of the vertical component and that the overall force or torque is equivalent to 0 in this problem. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Perfect. All right. In that case, we can move on to the next problem. So would anyone like to take a shot at this problem?
It will be reduced to 0.
Great. Do you mind letting us know how you got to that answer?
I thought of like Newton's third law because if that gluteal muscle is broken or is
Right.
severed from the leg, it wouldn't create any force. So then the reactive force would just be 0.
Perfect. That's actually the exact way I reason through it. Since if we don't have a force, we don't have an equal and opposite force. So when we sever the muscle, the lack of force means that the reactive force is also becoming 0. Sorry, with me. So I'm just working through having multiple displays up. So I keep forgetting to click on the right screen. But yeah, the fourth question. Would anyone like to take a shot at this one? All right. I can work through it then. Okay, so the place I started first in reasoning through this question is looking at work. So work is measured in joules, and that's why the answers are all in joules here. And that becomes really important because we have to convert through units here. And since work is force times distance, we need to look at how much distance happens in the hip joint movement. So we look into the passage and we see that the hip joint slides about 3 centimeters. And we convert that back into meters to get standard units, and we get 0.03. So the next step here is converting from frictional force, or from reactive force to frictional force. And so we see that equation right here in the FF equals FR times the coefficient. So we've seen here in the passage, seen here in the passage that the reactive force is equivalent to 2.4 watts. So we have that. And we also have the coefficient here as 0.003. However, we also have to consider that 2.4 watts is a measure of power and not a measure of force. So we have to convert that back. And to do that, we have to multiply by 750. 1 second. And so we come to the conversion of the newtons, or the watts, into a force. So to do that, we convert from 2.4 times 750 newtons, because that is the force expended by a 75 kilogram male, since the force would be their mass, which is 75 kilograms, times their acceleration, which is, in this case, rounding to 10 meters per second. So we have 2.4 times 750 times 0.003. And so we get 5.4 as newtons as a frictional force. However, we need to look at the work. So we need to multiply this frictional force by the distance that the hip joint is moved. So 5.4 times 0.003, because we're looking at, again, 3 centimeters, or 0.03, because we're looking at 3 centimeters. And when you multiply that out, you get 0.162 joules. Does that make sense to everyone? So just to verify, we get the 0.003 for this equation here from the coefficient of kinetic friction, and we get 2.4 from this watt here times 750 newtons, because we're converting into a force, times 0.03, because we are getting the distance to get the work. All right. I believe this is the last question for this passage. Would anyone like to take a stab at this one?
I think I put A.
Gotcha. So on the opposite side of the injured hip to maximize the lever arm. Perfect. Do you know why you got to that answer?
No idea.
Gotcha. Okay. So the way I looked at this question is by considering what the walking cane actually does. So the walking cane is there to support and minimize the sudden changes in force that a hip joint would experience, right? So if we are trying to use the walking cane to full effect, we need to increase the amount of force or torque that the walking cane provides. And there's two components to torque, and that is the distance and the force, or in the distance being the lever arm of the force. So if we're trying to maximize the amount of force that the walking cane provides, we're trying to maximize the force or maximize the torque. And in maximizing the torque, we can either increase the force or we can increase the lever arm. And since you can't tell someone using a cane to suddenly use the cane more strongly, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it, we can increase the lever arm of the cane. So a similar amount of force can provide a greater effect to minimize the sudden jarring forces that the hip joint experiences. So it would be A, we would want to maximize the lever arm of the cane. And to do that, we would move the cane as far away from the injured hip as possible so that the lever arm is greatest. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Perfect. All right. In that case, we have the next passage. Let me put the link to this one in the chat as well. All right. In that case, we can continue moving onwards. All right. Would anyone like to reason out the answer to this CARS passage? I tried to make it as relevant as possible to current things happening. All right. If not, we can work through this one together. So the answer to this question is C. And that is because the main point that the question is making is talking about free vaccinations being ended because it was too expensive. And they're trying to compare it to the author's point about politicization of vaccines on vaccination rates. God, okay. So we have here that the answer is C because the vaccination rates are less available in rural areas if this program did exist, because the vaccines would be too expensive to bring all the way into the rural areas, and so there would be less vaccination because it is less reliable. However, the author makes the claim of fearing side effects, and that's why people are getting vaccinated less. So since this says the opposite, and that the vaccination rates are decreasing because of lesser availability of these vaccines and not because people are scared of their side effects, the author's point would be weakened in this paragraph. Does that make sense to everyone? And this would be a kind of problem where we would be reasoning beyond the text, since this the point that the program that they're mentioning in the question comes from outside of the text, and we're trying to see how it relates to what the author themselves say. If there are no questions, we can move on to the next one. Would anyone like to take a shot at this one? All right. If not, go through it together. And the correct answer here is B. And that's because we see here in the passage that the author talks about how politicians need to be clear if they talk about the vaccine, and for their main goal should be avoid muddying the waters. So the author almost directly recommends that they really shouldn't talk about the vaccine and cause more concern and more discussion or argumentation between the people. So the correct answer for this one would be B, since a politician taking this course would not muddy the water at all. They wouldn't talk about the vaccine at all. And so it follows directly with what the author says. This question would also be reasoning beyond the text because we are adding a new component here by talking about hypothetical politicians and comparing it back to the text to see what would the author feel about these politicians. Feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat if you have any questions. But for now, I am going to move forward. Is there anyone that would like to take a shot at this one?
I think the answer is A.
Can you walk us through the reasoning of how you got to that answer, if that's okay?
Well, I think when I did this, these might be out of order than what I
Gotcha. Yeah,
but
that's fair.
I do remember that I put the answer for A, because when they showed it in the paragraph 3, they did mention it as like a worldwide issue, and
Gotcha.
yeah, that's what I remember. But I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I did get this one right, but I have it out of order on my thing.
Yeah, and that's the thing about Khan Academy passages. I think they're pretty good, but they also do randomize the answers every time, so it's hard for someone to say, I got this one, and for that to be the same answer that I have on my screen. So no worries. So this one is pretty straightforward in terms of it's just a comprehension question. When you look at paragraph 3, we see that it talks about how immunization protects people that both have the vaccine and people that don't have the vaccine. And so it talks about how, overall, it talks about how vaccination can prevent overall, how do I put this, disease and death in the population. So the most direct way to turn that into an answer choice would be D. The WHO's assessment is mentioned because it emphasizes the importance of vaccination to prevent disease and death. And again, please feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions about that one. But for right now, I'm going to move forward. This should be the last question for this passage. If anyone would like to take a shot at this one, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Isn't it C?
Yes, it is. Do you want to walk us through why?
Yeah, when I was reading this, I thought that opportunism was the one that best fitted because they mentioned like certain governors' names, and they like it kind of like implied that they were being anti-vax because it would get them more voters.
Right. Yep, that's actually the perfect way to look at it. And that's generally the exact way I thought about the question as well, is that as I was reading through the passage, we see politicians being mentioned due to their presentation of the topic based on how it would help them garner votes or support. So, and you can see I've highlighted the exact phrase that pretty much gives it straight away, is that those in public office use topics like these to score political points and win public acceptance. That sounds like a pretty good example of opportunism to me. But yeah, that should be the end of. Oh, no, we got one more. All right, last question. Yep. No, we got actually. But if anyone would like to take a shot at this one, please feel free to unmute yourself. But I think I'll go ahead and do this one. So for this one, we have the answer choice being A, at least on my screen. So that also goes back to this paragraph from the passage. And we see that the author directly mentions how their belief on why the vaccinations are decreasing is because parents are choosing to opt out because of side effects that they're hearing from the dissemination of groundless claims. So that, to me, pretty directly transfers to answer choice A, where it mentions decreases in vaccination and how that's due to dissemination of false information, or as the author puts it, groundless claims. So when we look at the other ones, we also have to consider how general the statement is, because we're looking at central to the author's argument. Something like B wouldn't be relevant to the entire essay or statement that the author is making because it mentions a specific politician. And C and D, C is not even said, and D isn't talking about the public's, that passage isn't talking about the author's, the public's intelligence. It's talking about how the information that is conveyed isn't helping to clear up the stance that people should take. And again, let me know if there are any questions about that one. But we've got the last one for this passage. And again, feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to answer this question. All right. So for this one, the answer choice is A. And this builds upon all the previous questions where we looked at how the politicians are opportunistic and how the presentation of this topic is causing people to make or influencing people's choices. So we look at the actual paragraph, and again, we see that a main point we can find in this paragraph is that people in public office are trying to use these topics to win public acceptance and political points. So we can find that answer choice in A because they're talking about political values that are being exploited opportunistically by politicians to frame the vaccine debate. That's it for this passage. I will. All right. So for here on out, we are moving forward into the passages that we haven't had a chance to look at individually before the session. So I will send the link to these in the chat. They are from Jack Weston, so you may need to log into Jack Weston to access this passage. Please let me know if you can't, and I will try to present it so we can find a workaround. I'll hold on for a minute while you get that pulled up, and I'll give you guys the next 8 minutes to figure out or to look through this passage and try to answer the questions that are associated with it, if that works out. right. So it has been 8 minutes. Please let me know in the chat if you guys need more time. Otherwise, I'm going to get started with the passage. All right. Does anyone taking a shot at this one and would like to let me know how they work through it? All right. If not, I can go ahead and go through it. So for this one, the main thing to look at is actually the understanding of the graphs. So we are looking at the effect that this DDE and DDT have on the cytochrome oxidase and succinate dehydrogenase in the redox chain. And the most important part there is that we need to understand that both of those components are in the phosphorylation part, the ETC part of the cell, or the cell functions. So what we know about the ETC is that it functions to create energy and ATP. So when we look at the relevant graph here, we understand that as the concentration of DDE increases, we see a reduction in the effectiveness of the enzymes. As we can see, the percentage is dropping as the concentration increases. And so we know that this means that we have lower activity for both the cytochrome oxidase and the succinate dehydrogenase, and that means less ETC activity. And when you have decreased ETC activity, that means less ATP are being generated. And less ATP means less energy. And so we have a solution that accounts for this decreased energy output, which is the decreased motility, because flagella do use ATP to rotate. Any questions about this one?
No questions.
Perfect, thank you. If not, we can move on to the next one. And yeah, just to cover, we have succinate dehydrogenase as part of the electron transport chain and the citric acid cycle. So I can understand if you were looking at C as an answer choice if you didn't exactly remember with where the citric acid component cycle components were, which, to be honest, I don't all the time either, although it is very useful. All right, number 2. Would anyone like to take a shot at this one?
The answer is D.
Perfect. And do you want to walk us through how you got to the answer choice D?
Yeah, because DDT and DDE, they cause the bacteria to grow slower.
Mm-hmm.
That's at least what I picked up from the passage.
Gotcha. Yeah, and that's you can look directly at the passage for that one, or we can work through it like we did for the previous question, because when you have decreased energy production, we also are going to have a longer scale of time that will take the bacteria to perform the functions that use energy. So we are going to lead into longer lag phases. So here we have the generic hypothesis for the phases of bacterial growth. We have at the very beginning of the time scale, we have the bacteria being placed into a new environment. Then we have the lag phase where the bacteria are adapting to this new environment. We have the log phase where they grow exponentially. We have the stationary phase where they are at some sort of carrying capacity based on the nutrients they're getting, the environment they're in, the space they have. And we have the death phase as the bacteria die off from overpopulation or lack of access to nutrients and so on. So we have that the DDT, DDE causes the reduction in the output of ATP. So that's one way to go about it, where you look at that the bacteria, it'll take a while for the bacteria to adapt to this lack of energy output. Or you can also look directly at the passage where it shows that it says directly that toxins, and we can take that to mean in this case DDT and DDE, can affect the metabolism of the bacterium and can cause them to take longer to adapt to growth conditions, as what happens in a lag phase where the bacteria are adapting to the new conditions that they are placed in. Any questions about that one? All right. So for the other answer choices, we don't have any actual evidence for C that any cytochrome oxidase activity increases. We do see that we see the decrease in ATP production for both DDT and DDE, since we have the decrease in their enzymatic activity on both graphs. And ROS, which are reactive oxygen species, there's not really a mention of them in terms of affecting these bacteria in a specific manner because of DDT and not DDE. All right, would anyone like to take a shot at this question? Okay, so for this question, the keywords here are anaerobic respiratory activity, and that should automatically lead you to a specific couple of metabolites or energy sources / sinks and electron transporters. So anaerobic respiratory activity automatically leads me to think of glycolysis. And so for glycolysis, we have, as always, a glucose molecule, ATP and NAD plus or NADH, that show up on the reactant side. And the product side, we have the NADH, the ATP, and 2 pyruvate from that single glucose. So when we have the answer choices for this one, the only one of these 4 that is directly relevant to the purely anaerobic part of cellular respiration is NADH, because we put in NAD plus and we get out NADH. So if we're trying to measure the anaerobic respiratory activity, it is very, very important that we measure the product of glycolysis, the anaerobic respiratory action. So we would be following the levels of NADH. The other ones, FADH, oxaloacetate, succinate. Oxaloacetate and succinate are most relevant for this problem in terms of the citric acid cycle. However, that is an aerobic process. We do need oxygen to continue and finish out the process. So it wouldn't be relevant here. And FADH2 is also created in the citric acid cycle, so it wouldn't be relevant here either. And the last question for this passage. Would anyone like to take a shot at this one?
So that would be A.
Perfect. And do you mind working us through how you got to A?
Well, like for example, like Taq polymerase is used because it can like withstand like high temperatures compared to other bacteria. That's most likely why like it's used.
Gotcha. That's a perfect way to look at it. And honestly, that's an even better way to look at it because you have that personal experience that informs your reasoning. But if you had to look at it purely based on the passage, we would go with A because it talks about specifically how the temperature here, the temperature increase, killed any other organisms present. So that is the important part of the passage to look at when you're trying to find the researcher's decision to use bacteria X, because they reference that it's the temperature that it can grow at, 65 degrees Celsius, is actually killing other organisms present. And we also have to think about how proteins are generally denatured at these high temperature, but bacteria X is still surviving. And we also have the reasoning for the other answer choices here. C as in, if we can't really get DDT to enter the cell, we wouldn't really have an experiment that worked because we wouldn't see any effects from DDT affecting the bacteria. And B, if the bacteria is able to grow and depleted of nutrients, we wouldn't see any different results than under control conditions. And D, if it was a common target, it really wouldn't explain the differences between DDT and DDE, and it wouldn't be an individual characteristic that is verbally, or at least written to explain the reasoning behind. So finally, we have the PsychSoc passage, and I will put the link to this one in chat as well. Does 8 minutes sound okay to you guys in terms of reading and answering, or would you like a little bit more time?
That sounds pretty good.
Perfect. I will give you guys till, I guess, 6:01 where I am. It may be different time zones for you, but till the 01 of just past the hour. All right, let's get back into this passage. So for the first question, would anyone like to take a shot at this one? Oh,
Role stream.
perfect. Okay. Do you mind walking us through your reasoning to get to that answer?
Because they're just like they're, I don't know, like they're just struggling, trying to like do what their patient wants them to do.
Okay. That's a good way to look at it. Honestly, if it's probably one of the best ways to look at it to like just separate the words role strain into the one role being strained into taking two different positions when it comes to that actual role. So it is, you're right in that it is role strain, but that's because role strain means that the role that you're playing sometimes causes you to take two different opinions on an issue. So in this case, as a surgeon, you would be responsible for both respecting the patient as a person. So that's one perspective, but you're also responsible for making sure they have the best health possible. So that's two perspectives on the same situation. And since they're conflicting, we would see it as role strain. And to explain the others, we have role conflict, which is where two different roles come into conflict in a certain situation. Role exit is where there's a position that we see ourselves in or we've played for a while that we suddenly choose to move on from. And role enhancement is where multiple roles that we play have a sort of synergistic effect on each other, and something we may use in one role can positively affect the other role and enhance it. And if there are any questions about that one, feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat. But in the interest of time, I will try to move on to the next one. Would anyone like to take a shot at this one? All right. If not, we're looking at an ideal bureaucracy. And so there are specific components that are really important in bureaucracy. And that is, we're really trying to make everything as streamlined as possible in an ideal bureaucracy. But we're also trying to instigate or create a system where each person does a specific role and they report to a higher up. So in this case, in terms of efficiency, we have the meritocracy component of an ideal bureaucracy, where the role that each person is in is designed for them. They're most ideal for that role because they have the most merit to take it on. We also have the control components, where I was talking about the separation of roles into a very specialized system where each person does a specific job and reports to their supervisor. So that has to do with specialized labor and the social stratification part, where each person reports to their supervisor to keep things as smooth as possible. So we've covered A, C, and D. And so the answer to the question 2 would be B, informal regulation. And we can also look at McDonaldization, because McDonaldization is a really great example of a bureaucracy that tries to be, in McDonald's case, as efficient as possible to maximize its profits. And so the 4 components of that are efficiency, so people can get more done in the same amount of time; calculability, so you can quantify everything and really skim down the excess fat; predictability, where everything is done in a certain way, so it is similar across wherever you're looking; and control, where things can be controlled on a very minute scale to make sure it's running efficiently. If there are any questions about that, again, feel free to unmute yourself, but I will be moving forward. Would anyone like to take a shot at this question? All right. If not, we can move forward and answer it. So the answer to this one is C, activation synthesis theory. And for me, it's really a process of remembering or connecting the activation part being the random neural activity where our brain is just randomly being activated when we are asleep, and the synthesis part where our brain interprets this random activity and synthesizes it into something meaningful to us. So that's really the way I try to remember activation synthesis theory. Our brain is activated randomly and then synthesizes these random activations into something meaningful. And we have, in the other cases, we have the Freudian dream analysis, where we're looking at the actual analyzation of what we see in dreams. And B, we have threat simulation theory, where our brain activates to, in our sleep, fend off threats that we may see in real life. All right. And again, if there are any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself, but I will be moving forward to the next one. The penultimate question. Would anyone like to take a shot at answering this one?
Backstage self.
Great, perfect. Do you mind walking us through how you got to that one?
So you whenever you're in front of someone, you act like, I guess, how they would expect you to act, but whenever you're alone, you act like your true self.
Perfect. That's actually a really great way to look at it. Like, you're presenting yourself in a specific manner if you're on stage, which is the front stage self. And backstage, it's more like you're just yourself. You're not trying to play a specific role or a specific character. So you can be who you really are. So that's what we see in this question, where they appear to be studious and hardworking, but each night they're just chilling and drinking alone, because they're not with anyone, so they don't have to act a certain way. Any questions for this one? If not, we can move to the last one. Damage to which area of the brain would most likely produce motor dysfunction? Anyone want to take a shot at this one? All right. So in this case, it's mostly a case of remembering the functions of the different sections of the brain. And we have the pituitary gland, which really controls hormones and hormone release. So we wouldn't have a direct effect on motor control. We have the medulla, which is mostly the control of unconscious procedures like breathing. So, and since that's in the hindbrain, or the oldest developed part of our brain, we're not going to see any precise motor control here. We have the cerebellum, which is actually the motor coordination, the balance. It's what gets really affected when you drink alcohol. And so this is the area of the brain that would actually produce motor dysfunction if it is impaired. So this is the right answer. And to finish out with the last answer choice, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, that is just a part of the brain that works to keep our circadian rhythms, our biological clocks, intact and working properly. So it wouldn't have any direct effect on motor function as well. Again, last question. So please let me know if you have any thing to say or any questions to ask about that one. But I do want to finish out with thank you. We are a nonprofit, so any donation really, really helps cover costs to stay a nonprofit. And if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to email us at this email address here. And if you would like to donate, please donate to us at ko-fi.com/MCAT101. But thank you for being here today. Hopefully your study and prep goes well. and have a great rest of your weekend. Thank you, guys. If you guys have any questions, I can stay for a couple more minutes. If not, have a great rest of your night. All right. I hope you have a great day. Thank you.